Well, the last point of news that we have here is maybe what feels like the most significant in Australia at the moment is the CPI was released. So the year-on-year or annual CPI as at January this year, 2022, is listed at 3.5%. However, CPI and inflation, even though CPI is the consumer price index and it's meant to be a measure of inflation, they are slightly different things. So I want to perhaps just mention what CPI is, what the problems with CPI might be, and then maybe some better ways to look at inflation. So CPI is just defined, and again, that's consumer price index. It's a subjective basket of goods that aims to measure the value of the dollar. So if CPI goes up, that means the prices of goods and services are also going up, and that means the dollar value is going down. So 3.5% means that the value of the dollar has decreased in terms of its spending power by about that amount over the last year. So that might sound like a relatively straightforward system, and it's nice and simple, but the problem is because that's a subjective basket of goods, the basket changes. And one of probably the best examples of this might be that land was removed from property prices in the 1970s. However, the buildings themselves of properties remained in the CPI basket of goods. Now, the buildings of properties, the structure, is actually something that depreciates over time because it has maintenance and repair costs, whereas land is often the one that appreciates. But by removing it from the CPI, we get some misleading statistics of how much, say, property is going up. And around this same time, there was some new stats that came out from Domain Sales that indicated that Adelaide properties are up around 27.5% over the last year. Canberra properties are up 36.6% over the last year. Sydney's up 33%. And that's obviously grossly different to 3.5% CPI. I was just curious because Jeremy's written an article about this for Hardblock, which I'll link in the show notes, and it talks a little bit more about what are the things to look at when trying to gauge real inflation, not just the CPI, which is the lowest possible figure of inflation. Jeremy, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think at the moment, if you read the papers, there's kind of this narrative that COVID has caused these supply chain issues, and that's why we have inflation at the moment. I mean, there's a couple of things there. 3.5 doesn't sound terrible, but if you try to get a term deposit at the moment, you probably get 0.25%. So if you do that over a long enough period of time, you go backwards very quickly. But the other thing is there's two kind of major factors that are, unfortunately, I think, going to make the inflation much worse. And both are driven by the lack of investment in oil and gas fields, which probably sounds like an antiquated thing to do, but natural gas is a key input to make fertilizer, which we need to grow our food, and all of the trucks and ships in the world need diesel to transport our food and everything else that we buy. And already I'm seeing worrying signs in the price of oil and even natural gas that I think are going to get far worse. And you will see that not just when you fill up your car, but everything you buy at the supermarket has to be transported there in a truck that needs to buy diesel. So there'll be a lag because, prices don't go up straight away. But I think over the course of this year, things that we just buy every day are going to go up in a surprising amount.
Very true. And I recall from reading an article as well, you do hit on that point, energy prices and the fact that, we use them directly, energy, but then we also have that as a part of our goods. And so that is a really good thing to look at, the prices of energy in terms of what is CPI really at, what is inflation really at. On top of that, you mentioned even the producer price index, which is what producers are paying before it then gets to the consumer. And often enough, the producer price index is more than the consumer price index. Given the producer price index is more of a leading indicator, that's a good one to keep an eye on to know what are the downstream flows of that inflation going to be, for the consumer.
Yeah, definitely. And when I wrote that article, just like if you were to look in Europe, the producer price index was in the teens, it was over double digits. And so the expectation is you would see that flow into the CPI a few months later. But nothing has really changed in terms of thinking that will come down. In fact, the way the price of energy is going, I think that will probably even go up further. So, but as I was saying, there's that kind of lag between, if you think about a producer like a truck driver is producing transport, that driver has to buy petrol today at the current price, but we're not going to see that impact our prices that we pay until quite a bit later on.
Very true. Another point that you note in your article that is good for people to keep in mind is the monetary inflation rate. So the rate at which the money supply is expanding. And over the last few years, it's been increasing every year as far back as you go. But over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, it's increasing at a rate close to around 20% and often a little bit over 20%. And so when you start to look at things like the energy price increases, the producer price index, things like the monetary supply inflation rate, the property price increases, you start to get a much higher number. And it's good to probably look at a cross-section of these things. I've just got a final point or two to make about this that might make it a bit more complicated. But again, this is a pretty complicated topic. And we sometimes in economics try to sum things up with a single number like CPI. And I have a problem with CPI at almost its core level, where it aims to be a unit of measure, but it's unlike any other unit of measure we use for the physical world, like, say, a ruler or a scale to measure weight. What I mean by that is it's a bit of a self-referential loop. So the demand of goods, and therefore the price of goods, is influenced by the value of money. But the CPI is trying to measure the value of money. So to say that another way, a measure that's aiming to measure the value of money is actually influenced by the value of money, because that will influence demand and therefore price of goods. It's a bit weird to think of it that way. Let me maybe give an example of what I mean. So say if meat prices go up, they go from $10 up to $100 for a kilo of meat. What would happen is that would influence people's spending habits. They would likely buy less meat and they might buy inferior products, which would then influence the CPI measure. And that makes it very contaminated in a lot of ways. Just as a final point, although this was an Australian-focused segment around CPI, it's also useful to know that America's inflation as of February the 10th is at 7.5%. That's measured by the CPI. Their producer price index is around 10%. Most people think that we're insulated from America, but it's useful to know that the Reserve Bank of Australia's reserve assets, the majority of them are foreign currencies, including the US dollar. And that's what's meant to be, in some ways, backing our own currency. On top of that, the International Monetary Fund reports that the global reserves of currencies are around 59% held in US dollars. So US inflation is eroding the entire world's savings, because that's what is by majority backing all of our own independent nations' countries. So something good to keep in mind, even though America seems to be much further ahead in terms of inflation, that does trickle down to us too. And it should be factored into the overall conceptualization of what inflation is and what it means. Any final points before we finish off?
No, I just wanted to say that all I know is my wife keeps complaining about the price of strawberries at the market going up all the time.
Absolutely. The meat is getting very expensive too.